In the last week of September 1975, in a farmhouse in the north of what was then called Southwest Africa and is today called Namibia, a small group of officers stood around a map and drew a line across a foreign country. The country was Angola. The line started at the border town of Rundu and ran north across nearly 2,000 kilometers of bush, savanna, and forest toward the Atlantic port city of Luanda. It crossed 3 rivers, 6 major roads, and a dozen towns whose names most of the officers in the room could not yet pronounce correctly. They were not planning a training exercise. They were planning an invasion. Portugal had ruled Angola for almost 400 years. In April of 1974, a group of young army officers overthrew the government in Lisbon, and the new Portuguese leadership decided, within months, to abandon every colony Portugal still held in Africa. By the autumn of 1975, Portuguese soldiers were boarding ships home from Luanda. Tens of thousands of Portuguese civilian refugees were pouring south into Southwest Africa, and 3 rival Angolan movements were fighting a civil war over what would be left behind. The first was the FNLA, based in the north, backed by Zaire and the United States. The second was UNITA, based in the center and south, backed quietly by South Africa. The third was the MPLA, based on the coast, backed by the Soviet Union and increasingly by Cuba. All 3 claimed to be the true government of Angola. Only one of them could be in Luanda on Independence Day, the 11th of November 1975. South Africa did not intend to let it be the MPLA. The operation was codenamed Savannah. It was authorized in the deepest possible secrecy by Prime Minister John Vorster and Defense Minister P. W. Botha. Prime Minister Vorster's government believed that a friendly UNITA government in Luanda would deny the guerrillas of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, safe bases in southern Angola, from which they had been infiltrating raids into what South Africa still considered its own territory. The war South Africa thought it was starting in October of 1975 was a counter-guerrilla operation dressed up as a conventional advance. The war it was actually starting was something much larger and much colder. The soldiers who would carry it out were told that they were on a training exercise. Their uniforms were stripped of insignia. Their identification papers were left behind. If they were captured, the South African government would deny they existed. If they died, their families would be told they had been killed in a road accident. 3,000 South African soldiers were about to cross the border into a war their own country would not admit they were fighting. At the tip of the spear were 22 Eland 90mm armored cars, freshly flown to a UNITA airstrip near Silva Porto, in central Angola, in the second week of October. The men who commanded them are worth naming, because the story that follows belongs to them as much as to the machines. Overall command of the largest formation, Task Force Zulu, was given to Colonel Koos van Heerden, a career armored officer in his 40s, previously the officer commanding the 73rd Motorized Brigade. Van Heerden was a quiet man, methodical, better known for the precision of his planning than for personal flamboyance. He would fight this campaign with a small map, a set of grid references, and a limited number of vehicles that he intended to use like a rapier, not a hammer. Beneath him were 2 battalion-sized combat groups. Combat Group Alpha was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Delville Linford, a veteran of counterinsurgency operations in the Caprivi Strip, whose troops included several companies of San Bushman tracker soldiers, so effective at their work that Cuban commanders would later admit they had considered the Bushmen an entirely separate threat category from the South Africans. Combat Group Bravo was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jan Breitenbach, 43 years old, a former naval officer turned Special Forces founder, brother of the anti-apartheid poet Breitenbach, and one of the most experienced small unit commanders in the South African Army. The crews of the Elands themselves were not veterans. They were national servicemen, boys of 18 and 19, drafted straight out of Afrikaner High School 6 months earlier, most of them from small farming towns in the Free State and the Transvaal. Many had never left South Africa before. Some had never seen a paved road that ran for more than 100 kilometers in a straight line. Their combat experience, in the second week of October 1975, consisted of 6 months of live-fire exercises and 1 final gunnery test conducted in the desert north of Walvis Bay. When Task Force Zulu crossed the border on the 14th of October 1975, some of its columns were navigating northward across Angola, using tourist road maps folded up in their drivers' laps. Not military survey maps, tourist maps, purchased, in several documented cases, from Caltex petrol stations on the road up to the border, and folded neatly around the coordinate system of a country the drivers had never entered before that afternoon. That is the image to hold in your mind as the story begins. A column of small grey armored cars, crewed by teenagers, driving into a foreign war zone, guided by fold-out maps designed for holidaymakers. They moved fast, faster, perhaps, than anyone in Luanda expected. By the 20th of October, 6 days in, they had captured the town of Rosadas. By the 24th, they were in Sadabandera. By the 28th, they had taken the port of Mosamede on the Atlantic coast. 2 weeks, nearly 700 kilometers, almost no resistance. In town after town, the columns arrived to find retreating MPLA fighters, abandoned buildings, half-eaten meals in the officers' messes, and confused civilians who had been told by the local political officers that no foreign army was coming and no foreign army could possibly reach this town in less than a month. Then, on the 2nd of November, near a village called Katengu, they met an enemy who was ready for them. Katengu is where the war became real. A reinforced MPLA battalion, stiffened by 51 Cuban military instructors from the newly established training center at Benguela, had dug in across the main road. They had mortars. They had recoilless rifles. They had a small number of armored personnel carriers. When the lead Eland troop of Combat Group Bravo came around the last bend in the road, the first ambush volley shredded the ground on both sides of the column and pinned the leading vehicles in a killing box between the road, the tree line, and a low ridge to the east. The battle at Katenge lasted through the 2nd and into the 3rd of November. When it was over, 7 MPLA armored vehicles had been destroyed. 2 of the Cuban instructors were dead, and a third had been captured. The road to Benguela was open, and Lieutenant Colonel Breitenbach, sitting inside a captured position that night, wrote in his notebook that this had been the best organized enemy his men had faced yet. He was not wrong. 2,000 kilometers to the north, in Havana, Fidel Castro read the reports from Katengu and reached a decision. On the 4th of November 1975, 1 day after the battle ended, he ordered the beginning of Operation Carlota. Cuban ground troops, not just instructors, would now be deployed to Angola in force. On the 7th of November, 100 Cuban heavy weapons specialists landed in Luanda, having been flown in a rush from Cuba's mission in Congo-Brazzaville. On the 9th, the first 100 men of a 650-strong Cuban Special Forces battalion followed them in 3 aging Bristol Britannias that made the Atlantic crossing at the outer edge of their fuel range. By the 11th of November, Angolan Independence Day, MPLA President Agostinho Neto stood on a stage in Luanda and declared the People's Republic of Angola. South African armored cars were, at that moment, less than 300 kilometers to the south. Cuban Special Forces were digging in between them and the capital. Task Force Zulu kept going. Van Heerden's columns pushed north past Benguela and Lobito, sweeping up prisoners and captured equipment, seizing towns, handing them to UNITA political officers who arrived behind the columns to raise flags. In 33 days, Zulu would advance 3,159 kilometers and fight 21 engagements. Its total dead, across all of that fighting, would number 5 men. That is why Igbo hurts. On the 23rd of November 1975, north of Zulu's axis of advance, a smaller South African formation called Battle Group Foxbat was ordered to push through a choke point at the town of Igbo, cross the Mabasa River, and continue north toward the town of Kibala. Foxbat, at that stage of the operation, was commanded by Commandant Eddie Webb. It included 2 troops of Eland 90 CE, a mortar platoon, and a battalion of Allied Angolan infantry. Cuban and MPLA forces had reached Igbo before them. They had reached it days earlier. They had walked the ground. They had studied the road. They had identified the exact spot where a South African column would have to slow down and cross the bridge over the Mabasa. And they had built an ambush around it with the patience of professionals. Rocket-propelled grenade teams were dug into foxholes 60 meters from the road. A 76mm field gun was set up on high ground with a clean line of sight down onto the bridge. And 2.5 kilometers further back, a battery of BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers was already ranged in on the killing ground, with their gunners waiting for the sound of engines. The lead troop of Elands rolled onto the bridge just after 10 in the morning. The first round came from above and behind. A shell from the field gun above the road punched clean through the turret of the leading eland. The trooper inside was killed instantly. His commander was pinned inside the wreckage as the vehicle rolled off the road and settled with its front wheels in the water. The anti-tank trap closed like a fist. It was a textbook engagement. They had lured the column into a kill zone where mobility meant nothing. Within minutes, 3 more elands were hit at point-blank range by rocket-propelled grenades from the tree line. The mortar platoon, deploying to return fire, was found by the first salvo of the BM-21s. A single salvo. 40 rockets in the air at once. The mortar commander and more than a dozen Allied soldiers died in the first 2 seconds of impact. The tubes were still cool. Somewhere in the middle of the killing ground, a South African officer standing in the open turret of an eland, directing a withdrawal by radio, was killed when a 122mm rocket detonated close to his position. Between 5 and 7 elands were destroyed. 2 more were disabled and abandoned as Foxbat pulled back. Cuban and MPLA troops walked onto the battlefield that afternoon and found them, still smoking, some of them still holding their dead. 2 of those elands were repaired, painted, and shipped to Luanda, where they were displayed as war trophies. One of them, according to Angolan sources, still stands today as a monument at Granite Heights, near the site of the ambush. The red dust of Ibo dried into its wheel wells half a century later. The eland commander pinned inside his wrecked vehicle did not die that day. He waited until dark. He crawled out of the wreckage. He walked through the bush and reached a friendly outpost the following morning, alongside the second crew that had bailed out behind him and hidden in a donga until nightfall. When he rejoined his squadron a few days later, his fellow crews looked at him, looked at the second eland he had already been assigned, and gave him a name that stuck for the rest of his career. 2 days later, on the 25th of November, a South African Air Force Cessna 185 spotter aircraft returned to the area to search for the missing crews and plot the front lines. It was shot down over Ibo by the same anti-aircraft units that had waited under camouflage netting for 2 days. The pilot, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Keith Williamson of Bloemfontein, his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Eric Thompson of Edenvale, and Foxbat's third-in-command, 32-year-old Captain Daniel Taljard of Centurion, were killed in the crash. Their graves would not be found until 2006, 31 years later, in a remote valley south of the town of Ibo, when a Pretoria couple working at an agricultural research station in Wakukungo helped an amateur South African military historian trace their final resting places and repatriate what could be recovered. Ibo was the darkest day of the South African Armoured Corps in the entire border war. Between 30 and 35 South African soldiers were killed or wounded there in a single morning. When the after-action reports were written up in Pretoria, staff officers used a phrase that would stay in the archives for decades. They wrote that the myth of the invincible eland had died on the Mabasa River. Tactically, the South Africans could still win engagements. Strategically, they were already running out of road. But the men who came home from Ibo did not stop. 50 kilometers north of the Mabasa, another river ran across the road to Kibala. It was called the Nia. The bridge that crossed it had been demolished by retreating Cuban and FAPLA engineers, in a deliberate attempt to stall the South African advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive from Luanda. In the operations map, the bridge carried no name. It was labeled simply, in the numeric shorthand of a hastily drawn battle plan, as Bridge 14. By the last week of November, Battle Group Foxbat had a new commander. Commandant Eddie Webb was replaced by Commandant George Cruyff, a career officer who arrived from South Africa with orders to break the deadlock on the Nia and open the road to Kibala. He inherited a shaken battle group, an army halfway to Luanda that no one at home was allowed to talk about, and a set of intelligence reports that suggested the Cubans on the far side of the Nia were being reinforced faster than his own supply columns could reach him. He did not have long to prepare. On the 27th of November, Lieutenant Colonel Breitenbach of Combat Group Bravo, whose battle group was operating on the same axis further south, needed to know whether Bridge 14 was still standing and whether the enemy had reoccupied it. He did not have aircraft to spare. He had a man. The man's name was Francisco Daniel Roxo. He was known to everyone in Bravo Group as Danny. Danny Roxo was Portuguese. He had been born in Mogaduro, in the mountains of northern Portugal, on the 1st of February 1933. In 1951, at the age of 18, he had emigrated to Mozambique, then a Portuguese colony, and made his living in the bush as a professional hunter, safari guide, and tracker. He was, by every account of every man who ever worked with him, one of the finest bush trackers in southern Africa. He had killed a leopard with his bare hands. He had walked hundreds of kilometers alone through country most soldiers would not enter with a company at their back. When Mozambique's War of Independence began in the mid-1960s, Roxo formed his African trackers and his fellow safari guides into a private militia and fought Frelimo insurgents for the Portuguese government, earning two of Portugal's highest bravery decorations, the Cruz de Guerra. He was awarded them twice, without ever having formally enlisted in the Portuguese army. When the Portuguese Revolution of April 1974 brought his old side to an end, Roxo refused to accept the Frelimo takeover of Mozambique. He fled south. He crossed into South Africa, and at the age of 41, an age at which most soldiers are behind desks, he volunteered for the South African Defence Force, completed the brutal One Reconnaissance Commando selection course as the oldest man ever to have attempted it, and was seconded to Breitenbach's Bravo Group as a platoon sergeant. He was the first foreign-born soldier in the history of the country to serve in the South African Special Forces. On the 27th of November 1975, Sergeant Roxo was given 4 Eland 90 armored cars, an infantry platoon, and an order to scout Bridge 14 and report what was there. He moved north through thick bush toward the Nia. Some kilometers from the river, he came to a low hill overlooking the bridge site. He halted his patrol at the hill. He left his armored cars and his men behind. And then, alone, on foot, carrying a rifle, he walked the last stretch of ground toward the bridge himself, because he did not want to lose an entire platoon to a possible ambush of one man. He did not know that a FAPLA position was already dug into the slopes of the same hill he had just passed. He walked past them, perhaps 40 of them, in shallow foxholes on the reverse slope of the hill, watched a single Portuguese soldier march quietly down the track toward the river, alone, and decided to let him pass. He reached the bridge. The bridge, as he had suspected, was partially blown, unusable to vehicles. On the far bank stood 3 Cuban soldiers next to what Roxo recognized from 20 years in African wars as a 14.5mm heavy anti-aircraft gun dug into a sandbag emplacement. He engaged the bridge guards, and in the ensuing skirmish, a brutal, point-blank firefight, he neutralized the defensive positions. Post-battle reports and debriefs from captured personnel later confirmed that among the casualties were seasoned Cuban instructors. He fought his way off the track on foot, rejoined his platoon at the hill, and walked them back through the bush to Bravo Group's forward positions before dark. For that action, Sergeant Francisco Daniel Roxo was awarded the Honoris Crux, South Africa's highest gallantry decoration. He was the first foreign-born soldier in the history of the Republic of South Africa to receive it. He would not live to collect the medal in person. He would be killed by a landmine near the Okavango River 8 months later, in August of 1976, when his personnel carrier flipped on top of him, pinning his legs and crushing his spine, and it became clear that his fellow soldiers could not lift the vehicle to free him. Danny Roxo lit a cigarette, smoked it calmly to the end, and then he died. He did not complain. He did not moan. Colonel Breitenbach, in his memoir, wrote only that a legend of the Portuguese bush wars had become another one, quietly, in the South African army, and had been buried at 43. His reconnaissance of Bridge 14 had confirmed what Foxbat needed to know. The bridge was blown. The enemy was waiting. And the South African advance could not continue until the gap on the Nia was closed. Through the first week of December, Foxbat and Combat Group Bravo brought up sappers, artillery observers, and BL 5.5-inch medium guns. Observers were pushed forward onto a hill north of the river, which the South Africans nicknamed Top Hat, from which they could see directly onto the Cuban and Angolan positions on the northern bank. Artillery fire, walked in by radio, began to grind the defenders down. Mortar pits were destroyed. Ammunition trucks were hit. Radio antennas were shot off their masts. On the far side of the river, the Cuban field commander, Raúl Díaz Argüelles, an experienced officer who had helped Fidel Castro plan the intervention itself, was ordered to redeploy his forces via Ibo to plug the widening gap in his line. He never arrived. His command vehicle struck a landmine on the road out. He was killed instantly. His death threw the Cuban defensive plan into confusion, with several of the units still holding the northern bank losing communication with their headquarters at precisely the wrong moment. By the 8th of December, the Cuban defense at Bridge 14 was leaderless and disorganized. On the 9th, at dawn, South African sappers went into the water and began to rebuild the bridge under artillery cover. On the same morning, 12 Eland 90 armored cars from Battle Group Foxbat crossed the improvised spanning column and fanned out onto the northern bank. The Cubans and Angolans had prepared an anti-tank position covering the center of the bridge with 9 M14 Malyutka wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The Elands did not oblige them. They skirted the road, moving through low ground on the flanks, and confused the missile teams who had trained their launchers on a road the South Africans were now refusing to use. In the fighting that followed, a young lieutenant named Van Vuren, commanding an Eland troop on the flank of the advance, watched a Soviet-supplied truck full of Cuban soldiers come rolling up the road behind his column. The truck's driver had switched on his indicator lights, apparently attempting to signal that he was one of them. In the dust and confusion, he almost got away with it. Van Vuren waited. He let the truck overtake his Eland. Then he put a single 90mm high-explosive round through its rear. There were no survivors. A short distance further along the same road, another group of Cuban advisors attempting the same trick with another vehicle was destroyed in the same way, by the same troop, within the following hour. By the end of the day, Cuban and FAPLA dead at Bridge 14 numbered somewhere between 200 and 400, according to South African estimates. Cuban and Angolan sources, in later years, would refer only and quietly to a military setback on the Nia. South African dead numbered 4. The victory at Bridge 14 was so complete that Commandant Cruz had to physically restrain his armored car commanders from pursuing the retreating enemy northward, because he knew, correctly, that his force was too small to convert a retreat into a rout, and that the road to Quibala, however open it now looked, ran into a country full of reinforcements he could not defeat. 9 days later, on the 18th of December 1975, near a set of river crossings east of Bridge 14, the moment arrived that this whole story had been walking toward. A troop of 3 Eland 90s attached to Battle Group Orange, under the command of Captain Fred Rindell of the 1st Special Service Battalion, was moving through low bush, looking for a place to ford. On the opposite bank, dug into shallow revetments that faced south, sat 3 T-34/85 tanks. Cuban crews, fully loaded. Their guns were the same 85mm weapons that had, 3 decades earlier, been fired into the streets of Berlin. The Eland stopped. The lead vehicle rolled forward alone. Its commander gave 2 orders: load, fire. A single round of high-explosive anti-tank ammunition left the barrel at just over 700 meters per second. It crossed the river in under a second and struck the lead T-34 through the front of its turret. The tank was destroyed instantly. Its 2 remaining companions reversed out of their revetments, turned about, and disappeared into the bush. Somewhere on that riverbank, in a 6-ton armored car, a machine designed for colonial policing, 3 teenagers from the Free State had just outmaneuvered and killed a 32-ton Soviet main battle tank of the Second World War, with 1 shot, from a gun they were not supposed to own, built on a chassis they were not supposed to be building, in a country that was not supposed to have been able to make any of it. The war was not over. The advance would falter. The withdrawal was already being planned in Pretoria, and in a factory in Boksburg, a night shift was already welding the next generation of hulls. The Eland had answered the question that Ibo had asked. It could kill Soviet tanks. The only question left was how many, and for how long.